Martha Jane Canary, more famously known as Calamity Jane, was born on the 1st of May, 1852, in Princeton, Missouri. She was the eldest of 6 children and had a very bad upbringing. Her father, Robert, was involved in petty crimes. He also had a gambling addiction, which meant the family was destitute. Her mother, Charlotte, spent time working as a prostitute, as well as resorting to petty theft in order to provide for the family. It must be mentioned that the information on her early life comes from an autobiographical booklet that she dictated in 1896. Supposedly, it was written for publicity purposes, so some of the facts may have been exaggerated, and at times, it's hard to distinguish between mere tales and the truth. In 1896, Martha Jane and her family moved to Virginia City, Montana. The reason for this is unknown, but it may have been due to the lack of work in Princeton and the hopes of making their fortune in the gold fields. From a young age, Martha Jane loved the outdoors, as well as horse riding. During the 5-month wagon trip, she would frequently go out riding and hunting with the men. By the time the wagon train arrived in Virginia City, she was considered a skilled rider and markswoman. However, sadly for Martha Jane and her family, her mother, Charlotte, died of pneumonia along the route. Eventually, they made it to Virginia City, and soon after, Robert took his family of 7 to Salt Lake City in Utah. Once they arrived, summer had started, and Robert began working as a laborer on a farm. He was finally making an honest living, but after just a year in Utah, he died. With no parents left, Martha Jane was forced to look after her 5 younger siblings, and she was only 12 years old. With no opportunities in Salt Lake City, Martha Jane took the family and all their belongings to Wyoming. After months of traveling, they settled in Piedmont. While there, she worked day and night in a variety of jobs in order to provide for her family. Her life was very tough. She was illiterate and extremely poor. Thus, she was forced to move around to get work wherever she could. Furthermore, as a teen, she apparently occasionally engaged in prostitution, as it was always a fast way for her to make money. Despite her setbacks, she grew up to be strong, tall, and driven. The world she was in was a man's world, and in order to look after her siblings the best she could, she took on a male persona. Finally, in 1870, she joined General George Armstrong Custer as a scout at Fort Russell, Wyoming. It was here that she began to dress up as a man. From this point onwards, her life was never the same. Instead of doing odd jobs, she was now involved in several military campaigns and conflicts with the Native Americans. She claimed that she was the most reckless and daring rider, as well as one of the best shots in the West. From 1872 to 73, she was involved in a campaign in Goose Creek, Wyoming, and it was here that she got her nickname, Calamity Jane. According to her account, a man called Captain Egan was in command of the post, and the troops were ordered to stamp out an Indian uprising. After a couple of days, when the soldiers were heading back to camp, they were ambushed by a large group of Native Americans. Captain Egan was the first to be shot, and he fell from his horse. Calamity Jane was riding in advance, but upon hearing the gunfire, she turned her saddle and saw the captain fall. Galloping back, she lifted him onto her horse and got him safely back to the fort. Captain Egan, on recovering, laughingly said, "I name you Calamity Jane, the heroine of the plains." Despite the fascinating story, many believe it to be untrue. It's certain that by 1876, she was known as Calamity Jane, as it featured in newspaper headlines, but it's more likely that she gained her name because she would often say to men who offended her that it was a court calamity. In 1875, Calamity Jane travelled into the Black Hills of South Dakota and soon drifted into the lawless town of Deadwood and settled there. Here, she became friends with Dora Dufran, the Black Hills' leading madame, and was occasionally employed by her. It was also around this time that Calamity Jane became friends with Wild Bill Hickok and Charlie Utter. Around this point in her life, there are many myths and tales, making it difficult to find the facts. She is said to have numerous affairs with some of the most notorious desperados of the time. One such story was her relationship with a Western legend, Wild Bill Hickok. Apparently, they would drink together and were romantically involved. Some stories even claim that he was the father of one of her children. There's even tales that they got married. On the 2nd of August, 1876, Wild Bill Hickok was sitting at a gambling table in the Nuttall and Mann's 66 saloon in Deadwood, when all of a sudden, his life was ended by a bullet in the back of the head by Jack McCall. Hickok's funeral was held the next day, and the entire population of the town attended the procession. That same day, a jury panel was selected to try Jack McCall. McCall claimed that he shot Wild Bill in revenge for killing his brother back in Kansas, and maintained that he would do it all over again given the chance. In less than 2 hours, the verdict of the jury was not guilty. McCall headed out to Wyoming, but less than a month later, the trial held in Deadwood was found to have no legal basis because Deadwood was located in Indian Territory. Thus, the verdict did not stand. He was then arrested on the 29th of August, 1876, and charged with murder. Then, he was taken to Yankton, South Dakota, to stand trial. This time he was found guilty, and in spring of 1877, Jack McCall was hanged for the murder of Wild Bill Hickok. In her autobiography, Calamity Jane states that she captured Jack McCall after he murdered Wild Bill. Supposedly, she had left her guns at home and had to go after him with a meat cleaver. However, this is completely false, making it difficult to know what really went on in her life. Following McCall's execution for the crime, Calamity Jane continued living in the Deadwood area for some time. There are also stories of her compassion, helping those in need. On one occasion, she saved 6 passengers in a runaway stagecoach, fleeing from a Cheyenne Indian war party. The party was in pursuit of a vehicle and managed to kill the driver by shooting him with an arrow. However, Calamity Jane distracted the group and took over the reins, getting the 6 passengers safely to their destination at Deadwood. Furthermore, in 1876, a smallpox epidemic broke out in Deadwood. Calamity Jane helped nurse many of those sick back to health. In 1882, Calamity Jane bought a ranch west of Miles City, Montana, along the Yellowstone River, where she kept an inn. Then, in 1885, she married Clinton Burke from Texas and moved to Boulder, where she once again made an attempt in the inn business. In 1887, she gave birth to a daughter called Jess, who was adopted by foster parents. There are numerous accounts of her having been seen with a young girl in several small towns throughout the West in the 1880s and 1890s, but there's no evidence of her ever marrying or giving birth. It is likely that Calamity Jane did have 2 daughters, although the fathers' identities are unknown. In the late 1880s, Jane returned to Deadwood with a child, whom she claimed was her daughter. During this time, she set up an event to raise money for her daughter's education. It was attended by many, and she managed to raise a large sum. Nevertheless, that night, Jane got drunk and spent a large portion of the money within hours. The next day, she left Deadwood with her child. Following this, they went back to Boulder, Colorado. During the next 3 years, the Burke family traveled through many of the northwestern states. For the next few years, Calamity Jane tried to sell her life story. Thanks to her reputation for being able to handle a horse better than most and shoot like a cowboy, her skills got her a place on Buffalo Bill's Wild West show in 1895, where she performed sharpshooting and rode horses. She toured many states and cities, such as Chicago, St. Louis, and Kansas. She brought the stage to life, giving the audience an authentic experience of the Wild West, just as she had lived it. Unfortunately, she would frequently end up drunk and was eventually fired. At that time, she was depressed and an alcoholic. Ever since she was young, she had been addicted to alcohol. In one incident, back in the mid-1870s, she rented a horse and buggy for a 1-mile joyride to Fort Russell and back. But she ended up getting so drunk that she passed out and missed her destination. When she woke up, she realized she was around 90 miles away from where she was meant to be. In 1900, Calamity Jane was found by a newspaper editor in Baldy House and was nursed back to health. In 1901, she was hired by the Pan American Exposition. She worked in Buffalo, New York, and her job was good, as well as her pay. Yet it all went to waste, as in an incident in a bar, she got into trouble with the police and angered the whole town. Because of this, they chased her out, and she was no longer welcome there. Calamity Jane returned to Black Hills in the spring of 1903, and brothel owner Madame Dora Dufresne was still running her business. For the next few months, Jane earned her living by cooking and doing the laundry for Dora's brothel girls. In late July, Calamity Jane traveled by ore train to Terry, South Dakota, a small mining village near Deadwood. Apparently, while on the train, she had been drinking heavily and had become sick to her stomach. The train conductor carried her off, and a bartender secured a room for her at Callaway Hotel. After this, a doctor was summoned. Jane died almost immediately after the doctor arrived, on Saturday, August 1st, 1903, from inflammation of the bowels and pneumonia. Her last request was to be buried next to the Great American Gunfire and her supposed ex-lover, Wild Bill Hickok. Her wish was granted. The funeral was the largest to be held in Deadwood for a woman, and Calamity Jane's coffin was closed by a man who, as a boy, she had helped nurse him back to health when he was suffering from the smallpox epidemic that took the lives of so many. Calamity Jane was buried on the 4th of August, 1903, at Mount Moriah Cemetery, South Dakota, overlooking the town of Deadwood. Thank you everyone for watching this video on Calamity Jane. I really hope you enjoyed it. I also hope everyone had a great Christmas, and I wish everyone a happy new year. That's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Lives. Thanks.